The church was silent except for the sound of crying. Then, a 5-year-old girl's voice cut through the grief with a song so powerful 200 people stopped breathing. That little girl was Madonna, and this was the moment everything changed. It was December 1st, 1963, in Bay City, Michigan. Inside St. Joseph's Catholic Church, mourners gathered for a funeral that nobody thought should be happening. The woman in the casket was only 30 years old. Her name was Madonna Louise Fortin Ciccone, and she was leaving behind 6 children, the oldest barely 8 years old. Cancer had stolen her in just 18 months. One day she was dancing in the kitchen with her babies. The next she was bedridden, her body ravaged by breast cancer that had spread too fast for 1960s medicine to stop. The youngest of those 6 children sat in the front pew, wearing a black dress that was too big for her tiny frame. Her name was Madonna Louise Ciccone, named after the mother she was about to lose forever. She was 5 years old, and she didn't fully understand that her mother wasn't coming back. Around her, adults were crying. Her father, Silvio Ciccone, sat stone-faced, trying to hold himself together for his children. Her older siblings were sobbing. Aunts, uncles, neighbors, everyone was drowning in grief. But little Madonna wasn't crying. She was watching, observing, taking it all in with those intense eyes that would one day stare out from magazine covers around the world. The weeks leading up to this moment had been a nightmare that no child should experience. Madonna had watched her mother deteriorate day by day. The vibrant, dancing, singing woman who taught her daughters to be strong and independent had become a ghost of herself. In the final days, when her mother was barely conscious, young Madonna would climb into bed beside her, trying to give her warmth. She would sing to her the lullabies and songs her mother had taught her. Ave Maria was her mother's favorite. "Sing for me, little one," her mother had whispered one of the last times she was lucid. "You have the most beautiful voice." Those were among the last words Madonna Louise Fortin Ciccone ever spoke to her daughter. Now, 3 days after her mother's death, little Madonna sat in that church pew, and something was stirring inside her. While everyone around her was collapsing into grief, she felt something different. Not sadness, not yet. That would come later, in waves that would drown her for years. What she felt in that moment was a strange, determined calm. The priest was talking about heaven and God's plan and eternal rest, words that meant nothing to a 5-year-old who just wanted her mother back. The priest's voice droned on, and Madonna's attention drifted to the casket at the front of the church. That's when she noticed it. On top of the casket, someone had placed a small bouquet of white lilies, her mother's favorite flower. And next to the flowers, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, was a small prayer card with Ave Maria written on it. Something clicked in Madonna's young mind, a decision formed that was part instinct, part desperation, part something that nobody could quite name. She stood up. Her father reached for her arm. "Sit down, honey," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. Madonna shook her head. She was small, but in that moment, she possessed a determination that was almost frightening in its intensity. She walked down the aisle. 200 people turned to watch as this tiny girl in an oversized black dress made her way toward her mother's casket. The priest stopped talking mid-sentence. Nobody knew what to do. Madonna reached the casket and stood on her tiptoes to touch it. Her small hand rested on the polished wood, and for the first time that day, tears started to form in her eyes. But she didn't let them fall. Instead, she turned to face the congregation. 200 pairs of eyes stared at her. Family, friends, neighbors, strangers, all of them adults, all of them wondering what this child was doing. "My mama liked singing," Madonna said, her small voice barely carrying past the first few pews. "She taught me songs." Her father started to rise from his seat, clearly intending to retrieve his daughter before she caused a scene. But someone grabbed his arm. It was Father O'Brien, the priest conducting the service. "Let her," Father O'Brien said quietly. "Let her say goodbye her way." What happened next would become family legend, a story whispered about for decades, a moment that some people claimed they witnessed even if they weren't there, because the truth of it was so powerful, it felt like it belonged to everyone. Little Madonna Louise Ciccone, 5 years old, standing at her mother's casket, began to sing, not quietly, not tentatively. She sang with a voice that shouldn't have been possible from such a small body. Ave Maria, gratia plena. The Latin words of the prayer song her mother loved most, the song they'd sung together hundreds of times, the song her mother had requested in those final painful days. Her voice was pure and clear and heartbreaking. It rose up into the vaulted ceiling of St. Joseph's Catholic Church and seemed to fill every corner, every shadow, every broken heart in that sacred space. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Even the people who had been sobbing fell silent. The little girl sang with her eyes closed, one hand still resting on her mother's casket, swaying slightly as if she could feel music that nobody else could hear. Her voice never wavered, never cracked, never faltered. It was the most beautiful and devastating thing anyone in that church had ever witnessed. When she reached the final verse, something extraordinary happened. Her voice grew stronger instead of weaker. It was as if every ounce of love she had for her mother, every moment they'd shared, every goodbye she never got to say, was pouring out through that song. Ave Maria. The final note hung in the air long after she stopped singing. For several seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, someone in the back of the church began to cry, not the silent, suppressed crying that had filled the space before, but deep, cathartic sobs. Within moments, it spread through the entire congregation like a wave. Tough factory workers from the automobile plants where her father worked wept openly. Elderly women who'd attended hundreds of funerals in their lives said later they'd never felt anything like it. Even Father O'Brien, who'd presided over countless services, found tears streaming down his face. Little Madonna opened her eyes and looked at all these crying adults. She didn't understand why her song had affected them so deeply. She just wanted to give her mother one last gift, the thing her mother loved most: music. Her father came forward and scooped her up in his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She felt his whole body shaking with sobs he'd been holding back since his wife died. "She would be so proud of you," he whispered into his daughter's hair. "So incredibly proud." But here's what nobody in that church understood in that moment. Not her father, not the priest, not any of the mourners who would talk about that day for the rest of their lives. Little Madonna wasn't giving her mother a goodbye gift. She was making a promise. In the weeks and months after the funeral, the household fell apart in the way that households do when the center is ripped away. Her father tried his best, but he was a man of the 1960s, working long hours to support 6 young children on a factory salary. He hired housekeepers, he leaned on family, he did everything he could, but nothing could replace what was lost. Madonna, the youngest daughter, began to change. The quiet, observant child became something else, someone else. She became demanding, loud, always seeking attention, always performing, always pushing boundaries. Her teachers called her difficult, her relatives called her wild, her siblings called her impossible. But what they didn't understand was that Madonna had learned something profound in that church when she was 5 years old. She'd learned that performance was power, that when she sang, people paid attention. When she performed, she mattered. When she commanded a room, she couldn't be ignored or forgotten or left behind. She'd also learned something darker. Her mother had died. The person she loved most in the world had been taken away without warning, without fairness, without mercy. If death could come for her mother at 30, it could come for anyone at any time. So Madonna made another promise to herself, though she wouldn't have had the words to articulate it at 5 years old. She would live so intensely, so completely, so absolutely that death could never erase her. She would make such an impact on the world that her name would live forever. She would become immortal through fame. Years later, when Madonna was already a global superstar, a reporter asked her about the defining moment of her childhood. She could have talked about many things: her father's remarriage, moving to Rochester, her dance teachers, her move to New York. Instead, she talked about that funeral. "I grew up in one single moment," she said. "I was 5 years old, standing at my mother's casket, and I sang for her. And I realized that day that performance wasn't just entertainment, it was survival, it was power. It was the only thing that could make death, even for a moment, stop winning. The reporter asked if that was when she decided to become a performer. Madonna shook her head. I didn't decide anything. It decided me. From that day forward, I knew I had to perform. Not wanted to, had to, like breathing, like my heart beating. I had to make my mother proud. I had to make sure that both of us, her and me, would be remembered. The priest who officiated her mother's funeral, Father O'Brien, lived until 2004. Before he died, he gave an interview to a local Michigan newspaper. They asked him about the most memorable moment in his 50 years of service. He talked about that little girl singing at her mother's funeral. I've never witnessed anything like it, he said, before or since. It wasn't just a child singing. It was like watching someone discover who they were meant to be, like watching a star being born in real time. Everyone in that church felt it. We all knew we were witnessing something important, though none of us could have predicted just how important. The reporter asked if he'd followed Madonna's career. Father O'Brien smiled. Of course. And you know what? Every time I see her perform, even when she's doing something controversial, even when people criticize her, I remember that little girl in the too big black dress singing for her mother. And I think, she's still singing for her mother. She's still keeping that promise. Madonna's relationship with her mother's memory has been complicated and profound. She's spoken about it in interviews, written about it in songs, referenced it in performances. The loss of her mother at such a young age created a wound that never fully healed, but it also created the drive that propelled her to become one of the most influential artists in history. She named her first daughter Lourdes but calls her Lola, never using her mother's name, as if that name is too sacred, too painful, too powerful to say casually. She's visited her mother's grave countless times over the years, sometimes with cameras following, often alone in the middle of the night when nobody would see. And according to people close to her, she still sings Ave Maria, but only in private, only when she's alone, only when she needs to remember where she came from and why she fights so hard to stay relevant, to stay visible, to stay alive in the public consciousness. Because, for Madonna, being forgotten is a fate worse than death. Being invisible means her mother died for nothing. But being seen, being remembered, being immortal through fame, that means the little girl who sang at her mother's funeral kept her promise. That means both Madonna Louise Fortin Ciccone and her daughter Madonna Louise Ciccone will be remembered forever. The story of that funeral is rarely told, even by Madonna herself. It's too personal, too painful, too raw. But it's the foundation of everything she became. Every boundary she pushed, every controversy she created, every reinvention she mastered. All of it traces back to that December day in 1963 when a 5-year-old girl stood in front of 200 people and sang for her dying mother. She learned that performance could transform pain into power, that vulnerability could become strength, that loss could become legacy. And 60 years later, Madonna is still the biggest star in the world, still performing, still pushing, still refusing to be ignored or forgotten, still singing for her mother, still keeping that promise she made when she was 5 years old, standing at a casket in a small Catholic church in Michigan, her voice cutting through the grief like a light through darkness. That little girl never stopped singing, and she never will. If this incredible story of loss, love, and the birth of a legend moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that our deepest pain can become our greatest strength. Have you ever experienced a moment that changed who you were forever? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the moments that shaped music's greatest icons.